Tourette's podcast is not a medical advice show. It's a show about experiences. In the course of that, we may talk about medications or therapies or stories from the doctor's office, but don't mistake any of that for medical advice or direction. It's not. Get that only from people or places licensed or certified to give it. Not from a massively fun and action-packed podcast about our life experiences. Such as...
Anxiety is absolutely essential for human survival. It alerts us to danger and prepares us to manage danger, and it also prepares us to handle kind of conflict and stress. And that is absolutely normal and completely healthy.
This is Tourette's podcast, made possible with support of the Tourette Association of America and part of the Geeks Rising Network.
Please leave your message after the tone.
Marijuana.
Hey Ben, this is Jerry Gidner from Season 4, safely hunkered down in Arlington, Virginia, on what seems like day 652 of the quarantine. I had a question for everybody out there in Tourettistan. So when I'm working out, and I'm working out hard, I'm trying to finish a workout, I am ticking like crazy the last half of that, maybe when I'm really tired. And overall, in my life, working out keeps the tics at bay. But when I'm working out and it's hard, my tics just go nuts. And it doesn't have to be that strenuous. I just was moving up from a 30-minute yoga session to a 60-minute yoga session. That last half hour was hard, and I was just ticking like crazy. Just wondering if anybody else out there gets this sensation where they're ticking a lot because an exercise session is hard in the moment. Wandering minds. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Angel, and I would like to say thank you to my mom and all the moms out there helping us. Happy Mother's Day. I love you, Mom.
Totally. Happy Mother's Day, Daisy. You have an absolutely wonderful son who snuck this message onto the Tourette's podcast answering machine. Surprise, happy Mother's Day to Daisy and to all the mothers of, well, to all mothers in general, but with special acclaim for all the moms, including mine, including Daisy, who have been part of the improvement of the lives of people with TS. I get a lot of email from mothers of newly diagnosed kids or kids who don't have the diagnosis yet, but it's fairly clear that TS may be afoot. And sometimes the first or last sentence of that email is, I hope this isn't a stupid question, but... And then what follows or what preceded is a totally reasonable and good question from a mother trying to educate herself about Tourette syndrome and what to expect. And that's perfect. It's just a really great sign to me that this mom is going about it the right way and wants to be educated so her son or daughter has the support that he or she is maybe going to need. You know, getting away from the stories we hear sometimes too frequently of parents telling kids to stop ticking, even punishing them for the involuntary sounds or movements they make. That's generally not the way to go about it. Doing it the right way might not feel all that easy, but props to the moms for taking that on and setting the example. Episode 2 of this season features one such example, and that's Angel's mom. Another special occasion to mark here, it's Sophia's birthday. Happy birthday, Sophia. She's the best discussion group admin on the planet. She turns 20-something today. By the time you hear this episode, it's possible the day has come and gone, but you can, and you should, wish her a happy belated, at least at the Tourette's podcast discussion group on Facebook, where she manages a hugely positive and fun page of hundreds of members who talk about the podcast, about certain points of discussion or, original topics too, and questions. I think it's a fantastic resource. There's more happening in the discussion group than I talk about here. And that's because it's a closed discussion group, so I'm not just automatically bringing it out into the open. There's a sense of security and privacy there. I mean, it's Facebook, so consider that, but it's a closed group, and you as a member can feel fine asking other members sensitive questions or sharing personal stories that you need help with. We vet the people coming into the group. There's some questions you have to answer before you get in, but anyway, that's all Sophia. Things are always good there, and that's thanks to the members who keep it real there, but chiefly Sophia for her time and consideration to it. So happy birthday, Sophia. Thanks also to the question from Jerry. Well, thanks, Jerry, for the question. That makes more sense. He asked if you've experienced a spike or an increase at least in ticking during exercise that feels difficult in the moment. And for me, I guess I do. I've talked about my breathing tics that interfere with me jogging or doing exercise where breathing the right way is important. And my tics play interference on it, and the harder I go, the worse it seems to get. But I haven't paid too much attention in tracking flare-ups of tics in myself anyway, in relation to exercise. And maybe it's because I've been a total sloth lately. So thanks to Jerry for the reminder to start working out again so I can shed the calories from these COVID snacks. Give us your thoughts on Jerry's question. Not just about working out or exercising with TS, but, do your tics escalate when the workout hits more resistance? Tourettespodcast@gmail.com. You can type your answer out, or you can send it in as an audio recording that I can just play on the show. That's how you leave a message on the Tourette's Podcast answering machine. So last week we asked the question, what's your favorite Tourette portrayal in movies? And I got 3 emails jokingly going with Deuce Bigalow, very funny. Just kidding, it's not. Of course, Front of the Class was a big one. Last week, Chris mentioned The Predator, the 2018 version, which I have yet to see. I'm going to, though. The Tourette's Podcast Movie Club. I just made that up. But check this one out. I got one recommendation from 1938. It wasn't available on Netflix, so I'm going to try to find another way to see it. But if we're talking about Tourette syndrome in movies, or any tic disorder, we're probably talking about, like 1990s up till now, encompassing movies that are either good or absolutely awful. But 1938 is pretty impressive. It's a Jimmy Stewart movie called You Can't Take It With You. And from what I've been told, there's a character with pronounced tics, and it's an operative dynamic in the story. So, gonna watch this. This recommendation actually came from the gentleman we're going to be talking with today on this episode. A different kind of episode covering perhaps the most popular single email topic I've gotten over the past couple of years. We're finally going to address this. Thanks to the brief voicemail from Haley, who correctly guessed one of the topics we're going to talk about today. Okay, the Tourette Association of America's inaugural virtual conference is right ahead. It's May 15th and 16th, timed with the start of Tourette Awareness Month. Go to touretteconference.org to sign up for the individual sessions you want to take part in. These are all being made available to you at no cost, all free. From yoga to adulting 101, to a research symposium, to mindfulness for tics, to understanding disinhibition and difficult behaviors. One that I'm particularly interested in hits on some recent comments in the discussion group and among a few guests we've had here who come from parts of the world where the culture doesn't quite recognize Tourette syndrome in the same way that I might be used to here in the United States. So at 2 p.m. on Friday the 15th, May 15th, day 1 of the conference, is a session called Navigating Cultural Challenges. It says here in the write-up, this presentation is geared toward adults and teens and aims to provide a safe space to learn about positive coping mechanisms and strategies to navigate culturally specific challenges. So the presenter is a 22-year-old student named Michael Chichioko. Apologies if I mangled the pronunciation, Michael. Here's where he's coming from in presenting this topic. His words, quote, many aspects of culture such as beliefs, traditions, and familial mindsets can all intersect with Tourette syndrome and have a significant impact on the way an individual copes with the challenges presented to them. As a Filipino-American college student diagnosed with Tourette syndrome since age 5, I've dealt with culturally specific challenges related to TS, particularly with finding a common ground of acceptance and understanding with my family and cultural community. During this session, I plan to speak about my experiences with Tourette syndrome as a Filipino-American, hoping to shed light on the impact varying cultures may have on an individual with Tourette syndrome. End quote. Head to touretteconference.org to sign up for this or any of the others on the menu. Again, all free, thanks to generous donors and supporters of the Tourette Association of America. Please consider likewise supporting at tourette.org if you can. This is a hard time for a lot of people, and TAA is out there providing support, but they need support to be able to do that so fluently. Tourette.org to learn more and to give your support. Okay, so the most frequent individual question I get, or the most recurring topic request that I get here, involves the potential for cannabis or marijuana, whatever word you use, to treat Tourette syndrome. Lots of listeners out there talking about this, asking about this, and I haven't been dodging the topic. I wanted to talk about it, but given how this audience has grown over the past couple of years, I didn't want to be lax about the kind of information that goes out, so I wanted to kind of put it out there in a tight and refereed kind of way. We're not going to talk about this in a Cheech and Chong kind of way. Our guest this week is not Woody Harrelson or Doug Benson or Willie Nelson or any of the other sons of the weed movement. We're going to talk about it from a science and medicine standpoint. What we know, what we don't know, what we're thinking in terms of it being prescribed specifically for something like Tourette syndrome, with our guest, Dr. John Walkup, who is a big name in the Tourette science field. When I started educating myself about that side of TS, about the science and research, Dr. Walkup was a recurring name, and I had the privilege of meeting him last year in Minneapolis. He has a really great, compassionate approach in addressing Tourette syndrome and the other pieces around it, like anxiety, which is the other topic we're going to get into in the second half of the show. So this season, I've been mentioning trying to quarantine my own anxiety by, however I can, looking at my own feelings of anxiety from a scientific lens, like kind of stepping outside of myself and seeing it as a thing unto itself, my anxiety, understanding why it's there in my brain, trying to read it for what it is from a scientific or biological sense, instead of seeing it as some faceless enemy that makes my stomach burn and makes the situation I'm in seem destined for terrible failure. Like, why do I feel that? What's it for? How can I use it? That's in the second half of the show. So happy about this episode. Let's get right to it. State your name and the kind of work you do and where you're based. Just introduce yourself to this audience.
So, hi, I'm John Walkup. I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist. I am the chair of the Pritzker Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Health at Lurie Children's Hospital. I used to be the chair of the Medical Advisory Board of the Tourette Syndrome Association, and now I'm a director on the board of directors of the Tourette Association of America. I've had a chance and the privilege of working with people with Tourette for probably close to 30 years now, and have watched the evolution of our understanding of Tourette syndrome over that time, and happy to be here and talk about what the current conceptions are of Tourette syndrome and what it means for people who suffer from that and for people who care about and love folks with Tourette syndrome.
Yeah, curious, what brought you into the Tourette bubble specifically?
If you really want to know, it was an accident.
Huh.
So I was told to go to Yale to become a great psychiatrist. And when I got to the adult psychiatry program at Yale, it became very clear that to be a child psychiatrist at Yale was a highly competitive activity. And I was advised to go meet people at the Yale Child Study Center. And I was introduced to a guy named Jim Leckman. And Donald Cohen was the director of the Yale Child Study Center at the time. And I was very interested in anxiety and depression. And I talked with Jim about being interested in anxiety and depression. And Jim essentially said, well, you know, we don't do that. We do autism and Tourette. And I said, oh, okay. What's Tourette? And so we started talking about Tourette. And I said, I'm really interested in anxiety and depression. He said, but we don't do that. We just do Tourette and autism. And he said, you should do Tourette. And I said, oh, well, okay.
And there you are.
There I am. So, you know, we counsel young people to follow their passion. And what I do is I counsel young people to follow great leaders. And Jim Leckman was a great leader. Donald Cohen were great leaders. And they essentially started me on a pathway that has been a huge component of my career. And it wasn't because I wanted that pathway. It was because that pathway was one where I had a great mentor and a great supporter, and they introduced me to things that were career changing for me through Tourette. And I've been doing Tourette ever since.
So you mentioned how our understanding of it has changed over the decades, new medicines, things that we don't use anymore. I mean, things always kind of come and go, and we evolve our perceptions about it too. One of the most frequent emails I get from listeners is about something that we haven't really dug into yet on the podcast. And we haven't because I want to be increasingly careful about the content here and not talk too out of school about this subject, which is marijuana as a potential treatment for Tourette syndrome. You know, lots of people asking about it, lots of personal testimony, anecdotes, and obviously, one substance put out for a whole class of people to try is going to return you mixed results, different experiences. But where are we on this with, trials, things that we should be considering, things we don't know yet? I know there's a lot to sort out there, but what would you say about this?
Yeah, boy, this is a long discussion. The Tourette Association has come out with a kind of a statement, if you will. And I think the bottom line from that statement, as I read it as a layperson or as a professional and someone who's been interested in Tourette, is that we need more research. Mm-hmm. I think the anecdotal experience of people suggests that there is some promise. But for every positive anecdote, I think we have anecdotes of people who didn't tolerate it and really struggled with it. Mm. And the other part I think that is interesting about Tourette is, on some level, uniformly, medicines that, dull mentation, if you will, whether it's alcohol or marijuana, for some people have what appear to be, for them, beneficial effects. And that is, it may decrease some of the emotional intensity that comes along with tics.
Okay.
But marijuana, like alcohol, also is a short-term solution. And we don't really know whether alcohol makes tics better, but people who drink alcohol during the period of time where they're drinking alcohol may feel better about the tics they have.
Right.
And I think there's the same kind of experience for people with marijuana. They may have a sense of well-being or a positive experience when they're smoking marijuana or using marijuana, and that may have an impact on tics overall, but it just may have a impact on overall well-being. Again, but it's short-term. And so right. I think the thing that we don't know about is if people use it repeatedly, whether that experience of well-being that they get short-term, whether that persists, and whether if people use it over an extended period of time, whether there are implications for functioning in other domains that aren't positive. So the biggest issue is that we can't really study it because even though states have made it legal, many states have made it legal, even recreational use legal, from the federal government point of view, it is illegal.
Right.
And most of the institutions that would do high quality research would have a relationship around human subjects and ethics of clinical trials that are overseen by the federal government. So it'd be very difficult for my university, Northwestern University, to do active research in marijuana because the research program is supervised by the federal government, and the federal government wouldn't look kindly on us as an institution doing research with an illegal substance. So what we have then is we have people who are innovating and doing interesting stuff and using it commercially. And even some of the pharmacies I think are doing very interesting work with matching the different constituent parts of marijuana to particular medical profiles. But they're not able to research it per se, like you would want to do in a robust clinical trial. We're going to be stuck with anecdotes for a while. There is research going on in Europe.
Yeah.
And there is some research going on here in the United States, but the only chemicals that can be used in the United States at this time anywhere are synthetic marijuana analogs.
Okay.
So compounds that are created by the pharmaceutical industry that look like the constituent components of marijuana, those can be studied once they get FDA approval to be studied. But what you would get at a pharmacy or at a store or off the street, studying that's not possible.
So you mentioned studies going on in Europe. Is there a history to that, or is this still pretty much emerging?
I think the people who study it in Europe have a fair amount of clinical experience with it and have studied it, and those trials appear to be promising. But I think the biggest issue with Tourette syndrome and treatments are whether the treatments that get studied have direct impact on tics or whether they have indirect impacts on tics. Because
Right.
we do know that medicines that decrease anxiety, decrease depression, increase well-being, those medicines can have secondary effects on tics. Because we know that people who are anxious tic more, people who are depressed tic more, people who are upset or under great stress tic more. And so if there are pharmaceutical agents that address that and give people temporary relief from that distress, it will have short-term impacts on tic severity. What we would be looking for in a treatment for Tourette specifically would be a medication that goes right after the motor movements more specifically and reduces in a targeted way the motor movements. And when you're thinking about compounds like marijuana or other medicines that have different targets, not specifically tics per se, they may impact tics, but they impact them indirectly. And sorting all that out in a clinical trial is difficult.
So this is something that is, let's just say hypothetically, tomorrow the U.S. Supreme Court makes it okay, and we can study. The studies are open, and your university can pick it up. I mean, this is years and years and years of research. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I think there are things going on in the world that are exciting. So, like the Israelis are looking at all of the different chemicals that are in the marijuana plant and are studying the properties of those from a therapeutic point of view and from a side effect point of view. And so they have the capacity to identify compounds within the marijuana plant that might have real treatment effects, specific treatment effects. So I think what you would see happening is an explosion in that kind of work where we would try and understand the over 100 compounds that are in a marijuana plant and trying to figure out what they do. And then once we understand what they do from a brain point of view, think about using them in people, animals usually to begin with, and then in people to see what beneficial effects they have. And I think one of the interesting things about the compounding pharmacies in the United States is they realize that that pure CBD or pure THC, the two big components that we know something about, in and of themselves may not be good. It sometimes requires a combination or a balancing of, a 70-30 combination, if you will, or a 50-50 combination. May work better for people. So what you would be able to test over time is there a combination of the different chemicals within the marijuana plant that have beneficial effects and ratios or combinations that don't work very well. That would all be the kind of research that would get done. And I think there's something to it because credible people have described benefit from it, but what they did, what they took, how they took it, I think that's what we don't know. And again, we don't know whether it had general effects on well-being or whether it had direct effects on tics per se.
It makes you wonder. So, in talking about kind of studying the individual components of the marijuana plant and maybe chemically manipulating to get to the most beneficial things that have shown promise or have shown results in tests, does that mean we can create potentially a medicine that is based on the marijuana plant, but it doesn't give you any high effects? Or is that well-being part of it where people, take it for the enjoyment of it? Is that what's playing a role in the edge off, so to speak, where your stress may be reduced for a temporary period of time and your tics may not bother you quite as much? I know there's a lot between those 2 points, but is that kind of something that's being looked at?
Well, that would be the kinds of things that I would be interested in looking at. But the business of doing a clinical trial in Tourette syndrome, the target for treatment would be a reduction in tics. as the primary outcome. But that sense of well-being, what it does to ADHD, what it does to anxiety, what it does to OCD, those would be secondary effects. But traditionally, studies of Tourette syndrome have only focused on changes in tic severity, and very rarely have they looked at the other parts of the syndrome, if you will, that people suffer from, and what the treatment does to those things. So that would require real research looking at real people with Tourette syndrome, really would require that it look at tics, that it look at ADHD, it look at learning, it look at anxiety and obsessive compulsive symptoms, and try and figure out what the pathway is for benefit. Right now, we don't do studies like that in Tourette, even with approved chemicals, if you will. We just tend to look at tic symptoms singularly.
So bottom line at this point, when someone poses the question of what about marijuana as a treatment for Tourette syndrome, the answer is pretty much there are a lot of research questions that need to be explored. There are some legal walls right now to that, at least in the United States. And that's kind of where we are at the moment. Do you see anything changing in any kind of roundabout way with that, or just in terms of us trying to learn more about it?
Yeah, I think the back channel learning is this is complicated because many of the pharmacies are for-profit entities. But they have an increasing array of chemicals within the marijuana plant available to them when they do the compounding. Meaning they can, and in some states where Tourette is a quote unquote indication, they can go to one of these compounding pharmacies and they can get, let's say a 70-30 combination or a 70-20-10 combination. And the process there is for the pharmacist to begin to work with the patient to identify what combination of the different chemicals and what ratios might actually be useful. And from a research point of view, those pharmacies can look at that data and say, we've had 30 Tourette syndrome patients and they tend to do better with the 60-40 or 60-30-10 combination than they do with the 30-60-10 combination, for example. And so we will be able to get in a kind of roundabout way, a back channel way, information from patients and these pharmacies that are using purified forms of the various constituents. So people don't have to smoke it, and so they don't have to have the deleterious effects of smoking or vaping. They can use purified chemicals that we have that are close to pharmaceutical grade, if not pharmaceutical grade. And over time, if there's enough patients who cycle through those pharmacies, they can begin to look at their data and figure out whether there are combinations of chemicals within the marijuana plant that seem to offer benefit.
We'll be right back. The Tourette Association of America is the premier nonprofit working to raise awareness, advance research, and provide ongoing support to those with Tourette syndrome or tic disorder. With a network of over 130 chapters, support groups, and centers of excellence, the TAA engages with communities across the nation in an effort to provide tools, webinars, workshops, and support for all seeking assistance. As a primary sponsor of Tourette's podcast, the TAA supports the authentic conversations showcasing the diverse representation of the TS community. To learn more, visit Tourette.org, Tourette.org. You had also mentioned the sort of orbiting things that may not just be orbiting things. They may be, kind of active parts of having Tourette syndrome, like the depression, anxiety, OCD, these other pieces. With the TS community, it's a big topic, anxiety and how to manage it. And, people may have anxiety disorders riding along with their Tourette diagnosis. And a lot of this stuff, feels like a package. So I get a lot of questions from listeners about how they, and comments from listeners really about how they feel seized by it sometimes, by their anxiety. And I deal with that too. One of the things I've tried to do with myself, especially more recently, is view it kind of more scientifically or almost objectively as a process of the brain to kind of quarantine my own anxiety and evaluate it as it's happening, which is easier said than done, but is interesting to me. What is happening when we feel anxiety? What's the brain trying to do? Is there an evolutionary purpose? Does it serve us somehow? How would you answer that?
Yeah. So I break up anxiety into kind of two components, if you will. It's a word that means a million things to different people,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm a clinical person, so I break it up into two things. One, anxiety is absolutely essential for human survival. It alerts us to danger and prepares us to manage danger, and it also prepares us to handle kind of conflict and stress. And that is absolutely normal and completely healthy. And when you think about that kind of anxiety, it is usually triggered by things that everybody gets triggered by. So like taking a test or meeting a new person or whatever. Our reaction, our anxious reaction, is usually proportional to the trigger. And it goes away when the trigger's gone. And it's entirely expectable. And that's normal.
Mm-hmm.
And in my business, in psychiatry, with every normal emotion or experience, there's usually what I call a pathologic form or an abnormal form that doesn't have that same value. So even human sadness, from my point of view, has an important role in society and in interpersonal relationships. So around death and dying, which we're experiencing now with this COVID crisis, being sad brings people together and motivates them to care for each other. And so just like anxiety is important for us in our survival, sadness is important to us in terms of our human relationships. But clinical depression doesn't do that, and neither do the pathologic forms of anxiety. And even happiness, which is a wonderful part of being a human being, has its own form, and we call that mania.
Mm-hmm.
That's pathologic. So with everything that we have as human beings that we consider normal and healthy, there's forms of it that aren't. And I think what we found in people with Tourette is they experience a lot of adverse life events because they tic. So they get self-conscious because they tic. They feel uncomfortable because they can't control their body in the way that they would like to be able to control their body. They can't.
Mm-hmm.
They can't control what other people think about them. But I would expect that all of those things would be expectable and proportional to the amount of tics they have and the position they are in and the kind of relationships that they have. But people with Tourette also have these pathologic forms of anxiety. And these are usually triggered by normal developmental experiences, not by kind of universal experiences. So in kids, we see kids who can't go to sleep alone. We see kids who can't order food in a restaurant. They won't raise their hand at school. They're afraid to go to an amusement park. Some of the kids that we see are afraid of clowns, where most kids really like clowns. So they have anxieties about typical developmental experiences. And what's interesting about those kids with tics and anxiety is the tics and the anxiety usually start at about the same time in development, between ages 6 and 12.
Okay.
So oftentimes when we see a new onset kid with tics, they oftentimes have an anxiety disorder that's presenting at about the same time. And those anxiety disorders are extremely treatable, and it's why you see a lot of patients who have Tourette, they're on antidepressant drugs, anti-anxiety drugs, as their kind of dominant treatment regimen, because somebody has picked up this co-occurring anxiety disorder, treated them for that anxiety disorder, and with the hope and potentially even the understanding that if the anxiety goes down, the tics will go down secondarily. So it is extremely common in kids with tics The adult form of anxiety is generalized worry. These are people who worry about the past and the future, about almost everything. They're the worrywarts of the world. And then the other adult form of anxiety disorder is panic disorder, where people have discrete periods of intense, rapid onset anxiety. It lasts 15, 20 minutes and then subsides. And they will oftentimes have these attacks 3, 4, 5 times a week. And the impairing part of panic is really worrying about the next one happening and beginning to avoid those things that they perceived as triggering that panic attack. And so people with panic disorder and Tourette, they will have increased tics during panic and subsequently, but they will also become impaired, if you will, because they begin to avoid things because they think that those experiences are the things that triggered the tics.
Right.
So, so that's how anxiety interfaces with tics. There's people with tic disorders have challenging lives to lead, and they're anxious in many situations, but that's expectable and proportional. But they also have these disorders of anxiety that really need directed treatment and can really make a difference if those anxiety disorder symptoms are under good control.
As you had mentioned, you can kind of self-isolate yourself to avoid the situations or circumstances that you fear may be triggering you. And that can be a pretty bad thing when, even in terms of, there's a hopelessness that can come along with it too. Just for people listening who may be kind of in that camp, where do you suggest they go, or are there online resources that you find to be particularly helpful in taking some first steps toward kind of reclaiming your life and some control? I mean, I know that's a huge zillion-dollar question, but what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the most important thing for people who have the disorders of anxiety, I think it's important for them to understand that their brain is playing a trick on them, and that the sense of fear or foreboding that they experience with the anxiety disorder, while it's uncomfortable, is not life-threatening. And that part of what they need to do is they need to, as much as possible, kind of maintain normal functioning and not succumb to avoidance behavior, because avoidance is really where the crippling aspect of anxiety comes from. If you think about it, if you avoid normal developmental experiences because they make you uncomfortable, over time you will not develop the types of adaptation and coping capacity that you need to function in adult life. And so we know that anxiety is extremely uncomfortable, but it doesn't really have any meaning in terms of your overall health. And so part of what we do in treatment is we ask people to do the things that make them uncomfortable for 2 reasons. One, they quickly learn that those things aren't life-threatening to them. And 2, over time, they begin to develop increasing tolerance of that distress. And it's not like the distress goes away, but their ability to tolerate it and cope with it gets better with repeated exposure to the things that make them uncomfortable. So while the natural inclination is to run and hide when you have anxiety or to avoid, the treatment for it is really counterintuitive and actually to throw oneself back into life, if you will, and develop increasing capacity to tolerate the distress that's associated with anxiety.
That's a really comforting thought that I'm going to write down for myself, because I've had serious panic attacks. I've had very rhythmic panic attacks where, they would be multiple times a week. And it's, even though by some point you have experience with panic attacks, they don't necessarily feel better as you go, or it sometimes can feel like, this is it. Like you have this doomful feeling and it doesn't feel like you're going to go forward. It's really important to remember, and really comforting to remember, that this is just a thing that's happening. It's going to wear off. It's, a bad trip, however you want to put it. It's not jeopardizing you in the moment. Just stick with it, and you have some resources, but this is not the end. I mean, you're going to feel better. Just kind of hang in there. It kind of makes it feel a little bit more, I guess, I don't want to say simple, but just getting through it is a ready possibility for you. And is something that I sometimes forget to bear in mind when it comes to just the really dark moments. So it's a very important thing to hear that from you. And the fact that, that there are answers in doing things that are the things you may fear, and kind of putting yourself in these situations, improving your experiences, and hopefully at some point, it's not that big of a deal, and you have exposed yourself to these things and you've gotten through them, and you have that to look back on for yourself. I mean, that's a really important thing to remember.
Yeah, I think about the pathway in managing anxiety as a heroic one, and I think that's what you're describing. No one wants this, and when I see people who have become afflicted with these kinds of challenges, I feel bad for them. But the life course of it is really to kind of, play the hand you were dealt and figure out how to manage it and to live a life that's worth living. And you can do that. These experiences, depression and anxiety particularly, can take the life out of a person, if you will. But they're both quite treatable, and they are strategies for managing them. And I do think it is a kind of a heroic struggle for people, and a struggle that people shouldn't necessarily feel like they have to do alone, but sometimes they do. But there is real treatment and real opportunity to do well with those things if you recognize them for what they are and take care of them.
Dr. Walkup, this has really been a pleasure. Is there anything about the subjects we've talked about that I haven't asked about, or you think maybe something I've missed, something that's important to leave us with?
Oh, the one thing I was going to say is there are people who have never had a panic attack, and you'll have to tell me whether this fits. But the experience that I think is closest to it for a person who's never had panic is what I call a near-miss car accident, where you're driving along and something happens out of the side and you slam on your brakes and you avoid the car accident, but your heart just pounds in your chest like it's unbelievable. You're not really lightheaded, but you have this sense of unreality. Yeah. And you're not necessarily in contact with your limbs anymore. Your hands feel funny, your legs feel funny, you're breathing hard. And it's extremely uncomfortable, but when you know what the cause was, you can kind of cope with it. For people with panic, it wakes them up in the middle of the night. It happens when they're having fun. It happens in any number of situations because it doesn't occur necessarily with a trigger. It can be quite spontaneous. And for me, that experience of a near-miss car accident is akin to what people have described to me about what the panic feels like. Yeah. And the idea that it could happen to you at any time without a warning, I think, is what makes panic disorder particularly challenging for people.
Yeah, that's a really great way of describing it. And the suspense of knowing that it may happen can also kind of bring about feelings of anxiety, a stomach ache. It's that there are so many pieces that just kind of, it's almost like you just kind of eat yourself. But again, going back to what you're saying about it's something that's occurring, but it's not something that's physically attacking you. You're going to get through it. It's no fun, but there's a way forward, and I think it's a very warm thought to keep. Yeah,
it's different than depression. Depression really, it's hard to power through depression.
That's true.
Depression. I'm an older guy, and if you think about making carpet, there's the warp and woof. It's that mesh that the fibers get woven into, and I think about depression as destroying that kind of basic structure that you weave experiences into, and that people can't power through. You see lots of people who have anxiety disorders who have lived with a lot of symptoms, but people with depression have a really hard time living with symptoms. They can't really power through that. It cuts bootstraps in a way. Make it difficult for them to bootstrap. But anxiety is different. You can see people bootstrapping and powering through some of those experiences. And again, they're both treatable, but you got to know what they are, and you got to take care of them and get good help. So,
well, and it's available, I mean, for depression too. So, I don't want to leave anybody feeling like, well, wait a minute, what about me? I deal with depression, so there's nothing for me. Like, no, there's definitely help. And I'm diagnosed with major depressive disorder, and I did some pretty intensive help for myself pretty recently, and it has made a difference. It's made a tremendous difference for me. And I had ideations, I had everything, but I see myself as in a good place now. It doesn't mean I'm cured, but it does let me know that I can manage what I have, and it's always nice to remember.
Yeah, respecting the power of these conditions to really take you off your game, and understanding that if you pay attention to them and you take care of them, that they shouldn't get in the way. Those two things, they have the power to disrupt your life in fundamental ways, and at the same time, if you take care of them, they can become non-issues, if you will. Or less of an issue. Really, really important for people to understand.
Well, Dr. Walkup, thank you so much. I mean, this has really been a pleasure. I've definitely learned a lot, but I mean, overall, I think it's been a very comforting discussion, and I just appreciate you taking the time.
Hey, thank you very much, Bennett. It's great to be able to talk to you.
So it wasn't a trivial, empty motivational poster thing when Dr. Walkup said it's a really heroic path to punch through and experience your feelings of anxiety or depression and go through them and feel that exposure to know what you're up against and learn how to counter these things and try to conquer them. I really do think heroic is the right word. And I'm decreasingly into over cheerleading people or declaring every little bit of personal progress a huge victory or anything. I mean, it can be case by case, but I'm way more these days into being intentional about stuff that we need to take seriously. And because we know how thick our anxiety or depression may be, I think heroic is the appropriate term for taking it on and going through it and turning the tides. It's not easy. Thanks so much to Dr. Walkup for being with us on this episode. He really is a great part of the Tourette community. And we're going to hear from more science folks quite soon. I do think there's power in putting personal stories together. And on that note, if you go to mytourette.org, you'll find this virtual quilt of personal stories. It's really cool. It's like a digital quilt with each square representing a personal story from the community. So you can hover your mouse arrow over it and it'll break out that individual story. It's really cool. That's at mytourette.org, and you can share your story too. I mean, go for it. The more, the better. Thanks to the Tourette Association for its support of the stories being told on Tourette's podcast, Tourette.org, and TouretteConference.org. And thanks to Geeks Rising for being the best network this podcast could be a part of. GeeksRising.com for this and other podcasts about culture and well-being and technology and creating. GeeksRising.com. Send your feedback to Tourette'sPodcast@gmail.com. And check out Tourette'sPodcast.com for updates and guest blog posts. I'm going to put up a brand new one this weekend. We'll talk to you next week, right into the start of Tourette Awareness Month. But let's talk in the meantime. Thanks for listening. This is Ben. Happy birthday, Sophia.